Good morning to our viewers in the United States. Good afternoon to participants joining us from Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And welcome to everyone, regardless of your location on this planet. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you with us today. We have a title that, on first glance might look a little bit dry: towards a secure, sustainable, and value-based supply chains. But that may mask the fact that supply chain policy can encompass everything, from national security to industrial and technology policy to human rights and climate. And that's why we're especially excited today to partner with the Heinrich Böll Foundation and to have representatives from the State Department and the German Bundestag with us to talk about these issues which are growing in importance. We're at the start of a new US administration. We are 6 months out from a German federal election, and there is no better time to be talking about these things. So I'm delighted to have you with us. And let me now hand over to our partner in this endeavor, Bastian Hermason of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Bastian.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for hosting this and cooperating with us on this. It's always a pleasure to partner with you at AICGS. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the German Green Foundation. As an organization that's focused on values-based transatlantic cooperation, I believe this is a historic moment that I hope we can all make use of. And the debate over our supply chains is critical in that, because this is really one of those issues where our strategic interests meet our common goals of protecting human rights and preserving the environment. So I'm really glad that you're all joining us for this debate. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Marianne Schneider-Petsinger, who's a renowned expert on global trade and transatlantic economic cooperation. I'm really glad you can be with us, Marianne. Thank you for taking this on, and over to you.
Thank you so much for setting the scene. And again, it's a pleasure to be chairing this session hosted by AICGS and the Böll Foundation at such a critical time for global supply chains. Obviously, the pandemic has really highlighted the structural vulnerabilities that led to shortage of PPE, of pharmaceuticals. But I think it's not the first time that supply chains have come under pressure. Just look back to 10 years ago with the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan. But I think what is different this time is that the rethinking of supply chains is overlaid very much with the geoeconomic and geotechnological competition between the US and China. And on top of that, we're also very much seeing consumers, businesses, and governments rethinking supply chains to make them more sustainable and to also take more account of alleged forced labor in supply chains. So again, we are at a very, very critical time, and it is my true honor to be chairing this discussion with distinct experts in this field. We are joined by Beth Murray. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs in the State Department. Very much welcome. Katharina Dröge, a member of the German Bundestag and also the Parliamentary Spokesperson for Economic Policy for the Greens. We have Peter Rashish with us, Senior Fellow and also the Director of the Geoeconomics Program at AICGS. And last but not least, Dr. Stormy-Annika Mildner, the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Germany and until recently also affiliated with the BDI. So some true expertise here, also joined by a number of participants. And as we get into the discussion, we are certainly encouraging you to participate in the discussion, submit your questions via the Q&A function. I should also very much say that this discussion is taking place on the record and will be recorded. But perhaps to kick us off, Matt, let me turn over to you. And from the US perspective, perhaps you can give us a better sense of what the main concerns are and also recent developments and steps that are taking to strengthen supply chain resilience. Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne, and it's great to be with everybody today. This is a terrific opportunity, and I'm thankful for the invitation to participate. As you've laid out, global supply chains are a critically important area right now. And obviously, as we seek solutions to these problems, transatlantic cooperation will be critical as we move forward. And so I think this discussion today is a very good opportunity for all of us to start thinking about that. As you've already laid out with global supply chains, there's a very diverse problem set right now. There are a number of different issues that we have to address. It's not just one sector or one disruption. It's not just one cause of a problem or one possible resolution. We have multiple areas in which we're seeing challenges on the supply chain front. And I think we need to be able to address them in a very comprehensive manner. You mentioned the pandemic. The pandemic has very much been, I think, a wake-up call for a lot of us about the various ways in which global supply chains can and will be disrupted. I know for us at the State Department and my colleagues across the government, including at the National Security Council, we've talked about a couple of the examples being the PPE problem that you mentioned last spring. How could we get personal protective equipment in sufficient amounts in order to help our first responders here in the United States and others as well? And I was posted at the time at the US Embassy in Beijing, and so we were very much trying to work to procure PPE from China to get back to the United States. But there are obviously a lot of challenges there. You know, and a second big story that's been on everybody's minds right now is the global semiconductor shortage and some of the production there that has been presented challenges for the US auto sector, as well as the German auto sector and other countries as well. I think as we go forward with supply chain issues, for us here, cooperation with international partners and allies is going to be critical. And if you look at the supply chain executive order that was released by the president, signed by the president a couple of weeks ago, there are several mentions in that document about the importance of engaging international partners and allies. And that's one of the points I would want to definitely emphasize today. And as we look at some of the sectors that are listed in that report, whether it's semiconductors or critical minerals or EV batteries or pharmaceuticals or then broader industrial bases, clearly we're going to need to collaborate with international partners and allies. And then just finally, I would just say that, you know, you mentioned US-China before. There obviously is, as we can see, a China factor in a lot of this, given the dependency on China in a lot of these supply chains, as well as some of the issues like you raised with forced labor in Xinjiang and the issue that plays in the supply chains. And we're also trying to grapple with many of those challenges as well. So I'll stop there, but I very much look forward to the conversation and for learning a lot. Look forward to learning a lot from my panelist colleagues. Thank you.
Fantastic. Katharina, let me turn to you. And the whole discussion again about reconfiguration supply chains is, yes, about resilience on the one hand, but what is being done and what more can be done to also make sure that supply chains going forward are more sustainable?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and to be able to discuss with everybody of you. I think it's a very good time to talk with each other after the election of the new President Biden. I think engaging in international partnerships is what is the fact of the time. And we as the Green Party hope to deepen interaction with you in the US when it comes to trade and climate change. And I think when we look at the pandemic, the question of vulnerability in supply chains, but also in economics is a very important factor. And we can learn from the pandemic, because when we see what we haven't done in the past was a proper risk analysis of our supply chains. We had the problem with masks in the pandemic, which all came from Asia. And when the pandemic started, we had the problem in the whole of the world. And from our perspective, we should have a better risk analysis. So maybe we should have more diversification in supply chains. And this is the same question when it comes to climate change. We also should have a better risk analysis where the problems are interconnected between trade and climate change and human rights and climate change. And we have to start a new agenda which combines both elements, and then we could better see the problems which rise in future and act now, from my perspective.
Great. I mean, to some extent, you hinted at perhaps the separation between interests on the one hand, economic, national security, and then the values discussion around human rights and sustainability. But perhaps those are interlinked. And Peter, let me now bring you into the discussion and kind of see and get a sense from you what the US and Germany in particular can do in that space to balance economics, national security, and those issues that are linked more to the values-driven supply chains issues.
Well, thanks, Marianne. I mean, I would say, first of all, I think at least implicitly, governments are always faced with some kind of balancing act between promoting national security and, let's say, values on the one hand, and kind of economic efficiency on the other hand. I mean, I think right now, in part because of the pandemic, the fact of this balancing act has become more apparent, I think. But I think it's always been there. In fact, I think you can even go back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, where he defended the British Navigation Acts as a way to promote British national security. So even one of the fathers of free trade was not always leaning on solely on the side of efficiency. So I think that trade-off is always there. I think that where the US or where Germany land on that there's going to be some overlap, but of course that's also going to be driven in part by their own perception of where their interests lie. And certainly there's been some debate about how much engagement either the US or Germany should have, for example, with China. And I think that there'll continue to be a debate, and we don't have to see things exactly in the same way, but I think we need to try to start from the same principles at least. And I think that's where we ought to spend some time, is thinking about what should be the kinds of principles that govern how we manage supply chains.
Thank you, Peter. And Stormy, perhaps let me ask you about the kind of firm level versus government level analysis of supply chains, because ultimately supply chains are strengthened at the firm level. So to what extent do you realistically expect supply chains to shift away from China when really companies do still want to have access to the Chinese market? And again, is there a role for perhaps greater public-private partnerships in this space?
There must be. It must be a public-private partnership endeavor. But let me first of all thank you for this very timely debate. This is not a dry topic at all, at least not from my point of view. It's very pertinent, and it reaches in a lot of different policy fields. And that might be one of the problems. We are still thinking way too much in silos. We are looking at health policy on one hand side, we are looking at climate policy, we are looking at economic policy, but we have to think across borders. And we also have to think across governance levels, both within the state and across states. Because what I was struck with the whole debate about resilience is this is not a new debate, right? I mean, we have talked about resilience a gazillion times. When the financial and economic crisis hit, when the tsunami hit, and there are lots of examples. And somehow it happened over and over that we got complacent again. I remember I was still at SWP at that time, both of the financial and economic crisis and the time of the tsunami. And we had a big project about risk governance. And we talked about risk identification, risk management, transatlantic risk cooperation, differences in risk perceptions transatlantically. And then the whole debate kind of faded out again and we got complacent. And what I would like also to discuss today with you, to get also to hear your opinion, is why that is so. Is it because we are not identifying risks? I don't think so. I mean, we know about climate risk. We know about climate change. We even knew about the pandemic, possibilities of pandemics. But apparently we don't prepare we don't prepare sufficiently. So it's in Rumsfeld's words, it's not an unknown we are talking about. It's not a black swan when we talk about global warming. It's more of a known unknown. We know about this, but we still don't do something about it. So who's responsible in quotation, marks? Is it because businesses aren't preparing enough for it? Is it because governments are not preparing enough for it? Is it because political structures are insufficient, which impede that we react to this? And I think it's all of the above. And this brings me back to your question: what can companies do, and what do states have to do? And the company level, I think we need to be specific with regard to where we are looking at, because in essence, global value chains hold up pretty well, I would say. I mean, the OECD looked at global value chains, and in most areas, they were surprisingly resilient, and in some they weren't. And some problems were exacerbated by government interventions. For example, in Germany was one of the cases, implementing an export restriction for masks. This led to a lot of trouble in our neighboring countries, also in the United States, also for German companies, which fed back into our problems. So I think it's a mix. And when we talk about answers, we have to look at diversification, we have to look at redundancies, we have to look at stockpiling, but we also have to look at international cooperation, what we need to do together. And just one last word, I think it's very, very positive that the G7 is focusing on the UK G7 presidency, is looking at resilience and is working on pandemic preparedness books, crisis books to foster cooperation in crises.
That's a very, very good point there at the end. But obviously also the question of how do you actually define resilience, because there isn't a commonly agreed definition. And again, what stakeholders do you need to engage to come up with that definition? Is there perhaps is space for the transatlantic partners together to move forward in that area, particularly also in light of what you mentioned, which is that different strategies are needed, and they also need to be very much targeted at each sector, because what works for one sector might not work for another. So thanks for that. Matt, you very much raised the issue of working with allies. And so the obvious question is, what do you see as an opportunity for increasing transatlantic collaboration in that space? And perhaps also, and that's where I'll come to the other participants too, what are the limits to that?
Sure. Well, I think, as we go forward here on the transatlantic side with supply chains, I think the first thing, and this goes back to Stormy's point, is that we need to have a very good understanding of what is happening and why it's happening, and looking at some of the risk mitigation, risk analysis. And so, one of the objectives of the supply chain executive order that the president just signed is that across 4 of the key sectors where we see definite strong interest in having secure supply chains, which are semiconductors, critical minerals, EV batteries, and pharmaceuticals, we're going to be doing 100-day reports, working across all of the agencies, collaborating and consulting, very importantly, with the private sector, and looking at where some of those vulnerabilities are so that we have a strong understanding. I completely take the point that was just made that we don't want governments to be in the business of getting in the way or of interfering. But we do have an interest in making sure that we can be supportive and do what we can do to smooth out bumps in the supply chain, to resolve issues where possible. And that's where the engagement with partners and allies will be really important. We've already been, reaching out to partners and allies in Europe about some of the various challenges that we're facing. I mentioned the semiconductor shortage and the auto sector. As I think everybody has seen in media reports and elsewhere, we've been talking with our partners and allies on that issue and how we can make sure that there's a level playing field for everyone as we're trying to acquire and procure a supply of something that is in short supply at the moment. But as we go forward, we're going to want to figure out ways that we can either perhaps launch new consultation mechanisms, either bilaterally or in some of these larger organizations where we focus on supply chains specifically, or using existing mechanisms where we can raise the issue of supply chain. The G7 was just raised, and resiliency, and I think that's a good example. There are also ways, not with the transatlantic side, but on the Asia Pacific side, through the Quad, through APEC, through some of these other organizations where we're trying to have more discussions on supply chains. And so, there's obviously opportunity there as we go forward for furthering our relationship with transatlantic partners to work towards resolving some of these very real problems. And as was just also mentioned, looking for ways to prevent these kinds of disruptions from happening again in the future.
Thank you. Peter, what's your take? Again, perhaps very concrete and specific areas for further transatlantic collaboration, but also some of the hurdles to that. And I'm thinking also of transatlantic tensions that haven't gone entirely away, that need to be managed outside of supply chain. So how do you balance the kind of shared concerns, addressing those, but also taking away some of the underlying tensions that need to be addressed?
Well, I think, as we say, you can probably walk and chew gum at the same time to a certain degree. I mean, I would underline the basic thrust of what Matt just said, in that I think there are some things that can usefully be done transatlantically, but other things that are probably more effectively done in a somewhat broader framework. So I think, for example, that the US-EU Trade and Technology Council that the European Commission has suggested would be a good forum, first of all, for discussing some of these issues. And I think, for example, in that forum, that the US and Germany and the EU could discuss some very practical efforts, for example, on whether they can develop using technologies alternative to certain, say, critical minerals that are in short supply, and whether they can combine R&D efforts, for example. I think there could be, for example, some agreement on joint procurement policies in terms of what kind of companies our governments would decide to procure from. But I think there are other kinds of issues which would be more effectively done in a broader framework. And I think G7 is one, but I think, for example, the OECD could be a very good framework to address some of these issues. The OECD has already done some good work on global value chains. It's already done some good work on guidelines for multinational enterprises. And I think if the US and the EU and other like-minded countries got together in the OECD to agree on some principles for supply chains in terms of human rights, in terms of labor standards, and in terms of some security of supply issues, then you'd get a lot of bang for your buck that way, I think.
Thanks. Katharina, what else really is needed to make sure that producers in the supply chains protect human rights and the environment?
May I add at first something about Stormy? She said
Definitely.
Some risks are unknown, but others are known. And she talked about the climate crisis. And I would totally agree on this point. And when we talk about vulnerability of supply chains, then the climate crisis is the risk we know. And we have to prepare for it. And this is one topic, I think, where collaboration between the US and the EU should strengthen and be broader. And we should have to discuss about an agenda of trade and climate change, from my point of view. And Peter and Matt didn't say much about this. And so maybe I could ask you a question about this topic, because in the EU and Germany and within the German Greens, there's a big debate about, couldn't we start a new transatlantic agenda about climate change and trade and put it together? We knew that the trade agreement negotiations in the past, the TTIP negotiations, stopped because of different problems we had with each other. But maybe there could be a new start where we combine, lowering tariffs and, on the other hand, rising climate protection instruments like carbon border adjustment mechanisms or something like this. I read about a proposal from Joe Biden about this point, and I think if we could build a broad transatlantic area for trade and climate protection, then we could be able to address the most severe problem we have as humankind in future. And this is about resilience of climate, of supply changes too. And on the other hand, Germany is working on a supply chain law. It's maybe about your question, Marianne, that you asked. And we One, that our firms make risk assessment about environmental risks and human rights risks throughout their whole supply chain, and then to address those risks and to avoid those risks in future. And I think this is a very good point to be more resilient when it comes to your supply chains.
I guess hidden in there was very much a question addressed at Matt. And let me add to that again. Are there any plans by the US to look at sustainability and human rights in supply chains?
Yeah, I think if, when you read both the supply chain executive order, but also I would definitely recommend looking at the president's trade agenda. There's a pretty significant part of the president's trade agenda, which includes the environment and sustainability, as well as climate, also tied into resilient supply chains. So, apologies that I didn't reference that earlier, but that definitely has to be a part when I mentioned that we have a diverse problem set, that it's not just about products being disrupted in trade that's not coming in at the rate that we're accustomed to, but these environmental issues and labor issues definitely need to be taken into account as well. So I think certainly building on the president's trade agenda, building on the references that we've included in the supply chain executive order on the environment and climate, and importantly, obviously building on the president's return to the Paris Climate Agreement. I think it is very important to remember as well as we go forward. And it's still early days in the administration. It's going to take some time for some of these policies to come together in more specific ways. But I think these are really important positive steps to the point that was just made. So I appreciate the opportunity to respond.
Marianne, if I could build on that, I mean, trade and climate does not seem to be an obvious area where there are any huge ongoing transatlantic irritants. So that's one thing. And I would echo what Matt said, that the new administration is making climate a huge part of its agenda. And Katharina, you mentioned sort of reconciling trade and climate. And I do think that, for example, an agreement between the US and the European Union to have a joint approach to carbon border adjustment mechanisms would help to reconcile those two, the goal of greater commercial exchanges with protection of the climate. And I think it also would tend to be sort of a way of discouraging supply in supply chains of goods that are violating environmental norms. So I think that you could certainly look at a work together on carbon border adjustment as one element of a supply and a common approach to supply chains.
Thanks. Stormy, let me give you the opportunity to come in as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mariana, you mentioned that first of all, we need to know what we are talking about when we are talking about resilience, right? And for me, it always has 4 components: the issue of preparedness, the issue of recoverability, so to bounce back, so to say, the flexibility and adaptability, and the fourth one, that's the most important one for me, and that's the transformability, the ability to use the crisis not to come back to the status quo before the crisis, but to use the crisis to change our economic systems, our societies, and how we do things. And I think this is a great opportunity right now because our governments are putting a lot of money into stimulus packages. And this money, I think, as has been done back in the last financial economic crisis, can be really used to transform how we are doing things. And example, climate, right? So we are, and infrastructure deficits. We have huge infrastructure deficits, both in Europe, in Germany, and the United States, and not just in roads and bridges, but also in buildings. And channeling the money we are putting out into projects which make us more climate resilient, for example, climate-friendly buildings, for example, infrastructure, that would, I think, allow us to jump forward. So President Joe Biden said, build back better. But maybe it would be even a better slogan to say, build forward better to transform us. I also wanted to say something on climate and trade. When I was still at BDI, we were skeptical of the environmental goods agreement, because there was a lot of fear that there would be discrimination between products which are very similar. How do you make really a distinction if something is climate friendly or not? Is a bike, for example, a climate good or isn't it? So where do you draw the distinction? I think we have moved a little forward. I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not with BDI anymore, but I think that would be a great transatlantic or maybe even G7 project to move forward on having a plurilateral agreement on climate friendly goods. And if the G7 does it, maybe others are going to join. I know that the issue of China was a big stumbling block, but if there is a bigger coalition of the willing, I think that would be a great step forward. And there would be a positive side effect. I think it would also give the WTO a new impetus, which that organization really needs. Last but not least, I wanted to draw your attention to the G7 panel on resilience, which the UK G7 has created. And Peter, on what you said, the OECD could play a big role in resilience of supply chains. They are, for example, also feeding into that panel, and a new report of the OECD is going to come out in a couple of weeks. And the 4 sectors which are going to be identified as being critical or products is exactly what Matt also pointed at: semiconductors, some pharmaceuticals, not all of them, but batteries and rare earth. It's really hard to define criticality for products because that differs across countries. And it really is also, it depends on how a product is being used afterwards. And then it really gets into the issue, where do you make the distinction? But with these 4 right now, it's pretty evident that these are critical. When we are thinking about answers, we have to analyze, however, where does that criticality come from? Is it God-given? Or is it because there was a government intervention? Is it because there were subsidies in some countries? And that defines how we are going to react to this. If it's a competition issue and a subsidy issues, and if it's something which we can link to certain countries, then I think we need to address the issue as such. If it has something to do with also human rights issues, and I'm thinking about rare earth, for example, or other critical minerals and materials. Has it something to do with regional conflicts? Then we need to address this issue maybe in a different way than the subsidies issue. And that's, I think, where we also have to do our homework to dig deeper where the criticality comes from.
Let's perhaps spend a bit more time on that issue of sustainability, because you all have mentioned it, and it's also come up in a number of questions that have been put forth by participants. And so one of the questions that has been raised, I guess, in addition of perhaps a transatlantic approach for an environmental goods agreement, is that issue of fisheries and forest supply chains. And the question is, what can be done to promote legality and integrity of fisheries and forest supply chains, which can also include illegal wildlife, with a view to combating IUU fishing and illegal timber trade and related wildlife trafficking? And then also perhaps related to that, again, that question of carbon border adjustment. Do you see, and I guess, Peter, this is addressed specifically at you, do you see and are expecting any collaboration between the EU and US in this area? Katharina, do you want to perhaps kick us off, and then we'll turn to Peter and anybody else that wants to come in?
Yes, but I have to apologize. I haven't understood the question right. So maybe you could explain it to me a little bit more about fishery.
I think it's just, again, 2 very concrete areas where there's concerns around the supply chains, forest supply chains and fisheries are mentioned as 2 illegal wildlife, for example, and illegal timber trade have been mentioned as 2 very concrete examples. And then a second unrelated question to that was around the issue of carbon border adjustment tax. And I've just seen that there's been another question for that by a reporter from Inside US Trade. Could Mr. Murray please address the possibility of a carbon border adjustment and offer some specifics on how this could play out? How much of an appetite is there in the administration to do this, and what are some of the concerns? So Katharina, perhaps then Peter.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for repeating the question. I think things which are very problematic in supply chains are, on the one hand, minerals, which come from conflicting regions. On the other hand, deforestation is one of the biggest problems we are discussing in the European Union. And this is one element which we couldn't only focus on supply chains, but maybe we should make a legislation which forbids products from those regions which cause deforestation, which is one of the biggest problems from my point of view. And it's the same question with forced labor. We discussed with China in our agreement about investment with China how they could ratify the ILO convention with respect to forced labor. But if they do so, then there is no way to make them stick to it. And so the European Union asked itself, how could we effectively ensure that no products which come from forced labor are sold on the internal market? And when it comes to this question, maybe we should make an import ban of products who come from forced labor. And then it's a difficult question how to control it, but I think the discussion in the European Parliament is moving this way, even if it comes to forced labor or if it comes to deforestation.
Peter, what's your take?
Well, of course, I can't speak for the administration, but I said earlier that that climate is not an issue, thankfully, where there are any ongoing tensions, at least that I see, between the United States and the European Union. That doesn't mean that it couldn't become such an issue. The reason I say that because the European Union is part of its recovery plan, and the broader Green Deal does have the intention of introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And of course, that mechanism could be applied to carbon intensive imports coming from the United States. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think with the arrival of the Biden administration, Katharina mentioned this, there's sort of increased enthusiasm and optimism, at least over the long term, in deepening US-EU trade relations on the right kind of basis. At the same time, the Biden administration has made clear it doesn't want to engage in a sort of traditional comprehensive kinds of trade negotiations until it's invested in the US workforce to make it more fit to compete. So when I put all that together, to me, there is a logic, at least, behind the United States and the EU cooperating on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, because it would be a way of, at minimum, heading off a possible source of conflict, and in a much more positive way would strengthen the transatlantic relationship. They would set some principles together, be able to express their values in terms of, mitigating climate change to get together in a way that really, that impacts the real economy in a positive way. So there's a logic behind it, but I can't, I don't know whether it's going to happen.
Matt, can you speak to that, or just a sense of appetite in the administration for a carbon border adjustment mechanism?
Well, just very briefly, I think, as I said a minute ago, it's still early days, and we're still having a number of discussions as the administration develops its new policies and the direction that it wants to go in all of these areas. Border carbon adjustments were mentioned in the president's trade agenda there in that sustainability and environment section. And I think that that's a good indicator that it's an area that we're going to explore our options for going forward. So I would just, for today, I would leave it there, but I think we'll see some more progress in that area as we go.
Well, we'll be watching very closely. There's a number of questions coming back to China, in particular one by Wolfgang Porzig on the US is recalibrating its approach towards China. It will rely less on supplies from China. Could this policy shift open a rift between the US and EU, and perhaps, let me add to that, Germany as well? And then perhaps combine that with a question from Tobias Gerke, who's saying that it seems to him Europe, generally speaking, is more concerned about green sustainability issues when we speak about supply chain resilience, whereas for the US, the big ticket item in supply chain security is national security around emerging technologies, and China with sustainability really playing second fiddle. So Stormy, perhaps you can walk us with some of your thoughts in that field, and particularly also answer the question, where does Germany stand on all of this, in particular to China, when it comes to supply chain resilience, but also, again, the sustainability angle?
All of this. Pretty broad question. Well, I would say that on China, that we have seen a shift in the last about 4 or 5 years. I would say that when I started at BDI, which is 7 or almost 8 years ago, there was still a great enthusiasm about China, and that China would eventually democratize, that it would follow WTO rules, that it would open up, and companies were really flogging into the country, setting up shop there, and at least not with the companies I know. Everybody has become very skeptical, especially with regard to the last years, what we have seen in China. It's rather going backwards than going forwards. And there is a much greater consciousness for the risks dealing with China. And I would also say, as long as China was not perceived as a strategic and systemic competitor, which it now is, there was more forgiveness towards certain things in China. I'm not talking about human rights, that's a different issue, but about subsidization, intellectual property theft. You know, I mean, there was always a problem and there was always criticized, but there was, as long as we felt pretty secure with regard to our position, there was, let's say, greater lenience for that kind of behavior. That is gone. That really is gone. Also German companies and certainly German policymakers are a lot more open to much more forceful actions against China. And yes, you can see this with regard to thinking about sanctions, but also trade defense instruments. There was a big shift towards anti-dumping measures as well as countervailing measures, much more openness on the side of German business, how they are used and how they are designed. And the same with regard to anti-subsidy instruments, competition, but also investment screening. And you can see that, I mean, you really can see that shift. Also with regard to new emerging technologies. I'm still saying German businesses are, I mean, they want openness.
I guess staying a bit on China. And
I don't think that it's all about green and sustainability issues, but also very much about security issues.
Okay. But just to follow up on that, I guess related to something that Katharina was saying, the US has already blocked the importation of apparel made from suspected forced labor inside China. Couldn't the EU match that action?
Are you asking me or are you asking?
Katharina, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I was also wondering to whom the question was, and I saw to Stormy maybe. I would totally agree to Stormy that we had a long development in Germany when it comes to China, and that Chancellor Merkel is learning a little bit, but not fast enough from our perspective when it comes to, is Stormy frozen? Okay, I think I will continue and maybe she comes back to us. There was also not that a good perspective from my point of view of Chancellor Merkel when it comes to China. We had this debate in Germany about the security of the 5G net, which was from my perspective one that was discussed much more intensive in the United States than it was in Germany, and the German government was struggling hard to find an answer of how secure this 5G net was if Huawei as a Chinese firm would be able to build it, and they haven't found a position yet. And it comes to semiconductors, which I think Matt talked about several times. And there is a discussion in Europe now about should we maintain our own semiconductors production, and we sharpened our FDI control at this topics in the past 2 years, and it's from my point of view a very good development that we did so. And now there is a question that a Taiwanese firm wanted to buy one Munich semiconductor supplier, and I think Peter Altmaier should look very sharp on this transaction, and maybe you should stop it because it's one of the last suppliers of semiconductors which we have in Europe. And so there is a rising attention in Europe, but on the other hand, it was Chancellor Merkel's doing that we finished the investment agreement with China at the end of the year without proper rules for human rights and without a proper discussion within the European Union and their partners. It was only discussion with France and the Commission, but not with the other member states. And from my point of view, it's very complicated policy when it comes to European unity.
Thanks. We did lose Stormy there for a second, but we're trying in the background to get her back on. Matt, I guess one question has also come up is the issue of the kind of, bringing on board other partners. Japan, Australia have been mentioned, particularly, again, in some of those areas of semiconductors, of rare earths, and of technology more broadly speaking, but also in terms of a carbon border adjustment tax. And to what extent, I guess, particularly on the climate front, is it necessary to also include China in those conversations? So how do you balance the kind of competition, but also cooperation with China?
Sure. Well, Secretary Blinken's been very clear about the area. When we look at China, we want to, we need to compete, but we also want to find areas to cooperate where we can. And Secretary Blinken and our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, are meeting with Chinese counterparts this week in Alaska. And they'll be having a broad-ranging discussion about the U.S.-China relationship. And it's going to include all of these areas. One of the things I wanted to build on a little bit was what Stormy was saying earlier about the very real concerns that European companies and European governments also now see in China. And I think to the previous question, I would make the argument that the distance between sort of the US government and business community's understanding of dealing with China and the European sense is that distance is narrowing considerably. And when I was in Beijing most recently from 2018 to 2020, if you compared side by side the reports that the American Chamber of Commerce was issuing versus what the EU Business Council, EU-China Business Council, or the Germany-China Business Council was issuing, a lot of those concerns were very similar. And if we had discussions with our foreign diplomatic counterparts about China, specifically, for example, the Xinjiang issue, we often found it was our German counterparts who had the views that most closely resembled ours. So I think that it's important as we go forward and working with China, and working on that issue. It's obviously a massive challenge for all of us, but we need to continue to have discussions so that we can share experiences, so that we can figure out mechanisms through which we can jointly address these problems. And again, whether you're talking about any of these supply chain issues, whether you're talking about the economic side or the commercial side or the national security side or the sustainability side or the labor side, there's got to be a discussion about China in there. And so I think the degree to which the United States with European partners can continue to have that conversation, that's going to be really important going forward. And that's a big part of what you've seen in a lot of the announcements by the president, secretary, and others, was that it's really important for us to be able to consult with partners and allies on these issues, including on China.
Could I pick up on a question that was asked earlier about the US having more of a focus on kind of what seems to be the national security side, and the Germany or the European Union being more focused on, say, labor and the environment? I mean, I think one of the really important things about supply chain issues, or trade policy for that matter, more broadly, is that it's not so easy to separate values and security. In fact, I think they're pretty reinforcing of each other. What I mean by that is that when China, or some other country for that matter, produces goods that are bad for the climate or that violate human rights, that is an affront to transatlantic values for sure. But that is also a challenge to US or German security defined as well-being. I think, economic well-being is the #1 responsibility of a state for its people. And if you're getting this kind of competition from countries that don't respect our values, that creates unfairness in the trading system, unfairness for American or German workers and other workers. So I think that it's not so easy to say, oh, this is security and this is values. I think in the area of trade, broadly speaking, they're quite interrelated.
Absolutely. And I guess that point is very much picked up also by some of the participants. Noah Barkin, for example, is highlighting that issue of silos, and has a specific question for Katharina, asking, the Greens may be negotiating a new German coalition government at the end of this year. Would you expect your party to take on the silo problem in order to better tackle the new nexus between technology, trade, human rights, and national security?
Yes, this is a big question, and thank you, Noah, for it. And of course, I think the reorganization of European trade politics would be one of the main issues we would like to talk with about one of the potential coalition partners we are looking at. And I think there are different approaches we could make. On the one hand, I proposed at the beginning of our discussion this new focus on combining climate change and trade policies in a new fair trade agreement approach. On the other hand, we want to combine trade issues and industrial policy issues. And we haven't talked about it that much in this round, but I think from my perspective, industrial policy which transforms your industry is one of the most important innovation aspects we have in Europe and in the US to be first mover in markets in future. And we as the Green Party strongly believe that we have to transform our chemical industry or steel industry into climate neutral industries. And if we do so fast, then we can, on the one hand, compete climate change, on the other hand, be the first to introduce a new technology in markets which are highly competitive, and where we have big problems with China, for example, in the steel industry with dumping prices, and we can't compete on the steel market anymore as European steel suppliers on the basis of prices. But we can if we have another new innovative technology, and if we use hydrogen for the production of steel, then we can introduce a new technology and would be the first mover, have new markets and an answer to China. So I think this is an approach who fits everything together.
Fantastic. Stormy, welcome back. Glad you are with us again. And I'm sure that you also want to come in on this question of industrial policy, but perhaps broaden up the discussion a bit about some of the other strategies and reforms that are needed, whether it's for the international trade system or domestically, for example, key for competitiveness. And again, supply chain resilience, also investment in infrastructure and education. So what else can be done in the kind of broader framework to bring supply chain resilience forward?
If I may jump in before I'm going to be kicked out again. Well, digitalization, artificial intelligence, better broadband, better connectivity, as has just been underlined by my connectivity problems. Now, joking aside, I really think that for supply chain resilience, digitalization and artificial intelligence can play a very, very big role to identify where criticality issues really lie, but also to identify and analyze your value chains. You can work with blockchains to also ensure sustainability issues, to increase trust and credibility in your value chains. I think there's a huge potential of artificial intelligence. On the issue of industrial policy, I have to say, I really don't like the word industrial policy because it comes with such a baggage. And I immediately think French approaches, which isn't meant by it, obviously. But so what industrial policy means for me is investment in the frameworks for a restructuring and future-oriented industry manufacturing sector. And that has a lot to do with putting money into research and development, and putting money into also infrastructure and putting money into education. What I'm always a little skeptical of is if governments are better in identifying the technologies which are the future technologies. I'm not always saying that business is so great in it, but I'm also not so sure if the answer is let the state decide which are the future-oriented technologies. And also subsidization sometimes leads into the wrong direction, as we can also see with some sectors, and subsidies here lead to subsidies there, and so on. But in general, I very much agree that there is a role for the state in there. On the issue of steel, I have to say, I mean, we are not the first movers anymore here, even if we put a lot of money into it, because there is already a lot of green steel production in China. For us to kind of catch up to this is that we need planning, a planning horizon, because the amortization rates of investment is it's really 30 to 40 years. I mean, it's a really long planning horizon. And the problem is there is an overcapacity on the international steel markets, mainly pushed by China. There are subsidies. I mean, the market doesn't really function well here. So the answer is here not, the steel sector in Germany and the European Union is squeezed, so to say, from all sides. Investments are necessary, definitely. The planning horizon is not 100% sure, though. But these companies are not making money anymore because of competition by China. So I think we need to come from all sides. We need to address the overcapacity and subsidies issue, but we also need to address the investment issue in Germany. Again, as Mariana said, I would say a clear case for PPP, public-private partnerships.
Great. I'm afraid we only have 2 more minutes, and so I'm afraid we'll not be able to get to all of the fantastic questions that have been raised, but would rather use the last, again, 30 seconds for each of you to kind of provide us with your thoughts on what the future risks are, again, the known unknowns and unknown unknowns for supply chain resilience and sustainability, and whether you think those risks are the same for the US and Germany. Matt, let's start with you and then do a quick round with Katharina, Peter, and Stormy.
No, I think one of the things that today's conversation has definitely confirmed for me is just how multifaceted the challenge is and where there are so many risks and vulnerabilities. From hearing this discussion, I think many of the areas where we see vulnerabilities in the United States and the areas where you see them across the Atlantic are very similar. And I mentioned the supply chain executive order. There's also the continued concerns around the global supply related to PPE and vaccines and all of those things that we still need in order to respond to the pandemic. There's also all of the sustainability issues that have been raised and the forced labor issue as well. So I think it's a very similar program that we're all going to be looking at, and we very much look forward to just enhancing the transatlantic cooperation that's already there in order to address these issues as comprehensively as possible.
Katharina.
I think the biggest risk is that you see the risk and do nothing. And this is a very political issue. And from my perspective, this is where we have to start. And when it comes to climate change, as an example, we see the risk, but we're much too slow to do something against it. And it's the same when it comes to competition with China. There had been a very slow debate in Europe. So politics has to be faster. And it's always the believing that everything can stay as it is. And this is a change of mind that politics have to do, that the future needs transformation, and you don't have to stick to the noun, that you have to be prepared for the unknown. I think then you are a politician who creates future.
Peter.
Well, I would try to answer that question by picking up on what Stormy said about technology and say that technologies do offer us a way to solve some of these. I mean, the challenges are obviously very important ones, but I think technology does offer us some opportunities to try to solve some of these problems, whether it's AI or the Internet of Things, or for that matter, 3D printing, in the sense that those technologies can not only help us understand better what's going on in supply chains, but also to reduce our dependence on, for example, labor or production processes that violate our values. On the other hand, that could open up another kind of challenge, which is that we will then end up using less labor at home as well, as we rely more on technology. And so even as we solve some of the problems with supply chains, we open up this other challenge of how to deal with what happens with labor markets.
Stormy, over to you for your final thoughts.
I would love to continue this discussion and next time to focus on a blind spot, which we hadn't talked about at all, and that is agriculture. Agriculture on both sides of the Atlantic, first of all, for resilience, but also for climate change. And maybe we can continue this dialogue on agriculture resilience.
Certainly a very concrete proposal there on the table. And I think from all of you, very much a call for action domestically, but also very much across the Atlantic. So thank you all for joining us for this very important discussion. Again, as Matt just highlighted again, we are still in the middle of the pandemic. So resilience is key, but also looking ahead with climate really being a key factor, not only for more sustainable supply chains, but again, also as a risk for potential supply chain disruption. Thank you very much, a true pleasure, and I'm sure AICGS and the Bell Foundation will continue to be engaged in this space. Thank you.